What if China wasn't communist? Today, the People's Republic of China is the second most powerful nation on Earth. So the alternate history question to ask would be, what if China was never communist? For this timeline to work, Mao Zedong would have had to have been wiped out in this timeline so that he never led the communist revolution that happened in our timeline that took over China. In this timeline, Mao's Red forces would have been defeated by the nationalists when he was fighting a guerrilla campaign in southwestern China. This almost happened, and nationalist forces cornered Mao Zedong many times in southwestern China, and it was only through Mao Zedong's intelligence and guerrilla wit that he was able to break out of these encirclements and keep fighting. He was actually saved by the bell, to speak, by the Second Sino-Japanese War, in which he allied with the desperate nationalist government to fight off the Japanese, and thus had time to build up strength for after the war he was able to conquer all of China. Until 1949, this timeline would likely be very similar to our own. The nationalists likely would have been able to fight off the Japanese, because the Japanese simply do not have the numbers or supply lines to attack deep into China, and so the effect of World War II would have been the same. After the war, the peace deals would have been very different. The Russians invaded Manchuria in the final months of the war, and since the nationalists were an American ally, the Russians would have been loath to give territory to an American ally, and so the Russians likely would have set up their own communist state based in Manchuria, as well as their own communist state in North Korea, like they did in our timeline. In World War II, nationalist China was a US ally, and so during the Cold War, we can assume that it would have likely remained this way. In the years after the war, US money and advisors would flow into China, trying to turn it into a more and more westernized nation, like Korea or Japan, in our timeline. With US weapons and money, the non-king centralized government would have likely been able to defeat the warlords of the other regions and unite China as a centralized state. In our timeline, nationalist China was controlled by a strongman called Chiang Kai-shek, but in this timeline with so many American interests involved, China would likely become a Western-style democracy over time. As a whole in this timeline, China would be a lot like Korea, a nation industrialized in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, being capitalist and democratic, as well as having a high standard of living. In our timeline, US and South Korean forces are able to push themselves all the way up to the Chinese-North Korean border, up near the Yalu River, before being driven back down to the 38th parallel by Mao's Chinese forces. But in this timeline, with China being a US ally, and Manchuria being so underpopulated that a war with the US would be suicidal, would mean that North Korea would be incorporated into South Korea, and Korea would be united under a capitalist regime. Manchuria would likely remain a Soviet ally and a communist nation until the end of the Cold War, after which it would either go the route of North Korea and Cuba and remain a communist nation, but without Russian subsidies get poorer and poorer and more isolationist, or it would go the way of Poland and East Germany, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, would cast off communism and being a Russian ally. One of the reasons North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam was that North Vietnam knew from the Korean War that if the US and South Vietnamese conquered North Vietnam, that China would invade North Vietnam to save North Vietnam. And so they knew that the Americans knew that, so they knew that the Americans wouldn't invade North Vietnam, so they'd basically be safe from American land attacks. But with China being a US ally, there'd be no certainty of this. There'd actually be a slight certainty that China would invade North Vietnam to help the United States, so North Vietnam never would have invaded South Vietnam in this timeline. And thus until the end of the Cold War, Vietnam would remain divided. After the end of the Cold War, North Vietnam would have the choices placed in front of it similar to those of Manchuria, but there would also be the choice that they would simply peacefully unite, since the division of Vietnam was meant to only be temporary, and the populations both wanted to reunite. Having the US allies being so powerful in East Asia would destroy the balance of power in Asia, and this would scare India and Russia. Thus, India and Russia would ally to create a balance of power. Being a Soviet ally and receiving Soviet weapons and subsidies would mean that India would likely slowly drift towards a more socialist government form. Whether or not this would reach communist levels is up to you. Whether or not the collapse of the Soviet Union would bring upon the collapse of India is up to you. On one hand, thousands of years of historical and cultural divisions divide India, and make it to the collapse isn't always very far-fetched. And, on the other hand, India is very large and economically powerful, making it so it wouldn't be entirely dependent on Soviet subsidies. And when the Soviet subsidies would grind to a halt with the end of the Cold War, that would mean that India's economy would also not grind to a halt with the end of the Cold War, eliminating a major possible reason for collapse. China, in this timeline, without 40 years of isolationism under Mao, would likely be a much more industrialized and powerful nation in this timeline. Because of this, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, China would immediately become the US's new rival in a new Cold War, similarly to the Fallout universe. In this new Cold War, the United States would try to arm Korea and Japan against China in the possibility of a new war. Since both nations would be democracies, that would mean that there could have been no way that this could be framed as an ideological struggle. Thus, this would likely be framed by the Americans as a battle to save Western civilization, and by the Chinese as a battle to save Chinese civilization, and would likely have a cultural instead of ideological spin. A well-armed Japan with a large military would terrify some nations in Southeast Asia that had had a bad experience with Japanese occupation in the Second World War. Thus, in this timeline, nations like the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam would ally with China to protect themselves from the possibility of a new well-armed Japan. In this timeline, a 9/11 style incident likely would have happened in China instead of the United States. This is because in China, there is a large population of Uyghurs or Turkic Muslims in the West, and thus the jihadis would likely try to use the Uyghurs as an excuse to do a terrorist action against China to help their own group back at home. In this timeline, in retaliation towards 9/11, China would likely invade Afghanistan and possibly Iraq, like the United States did in our timeline. Surprisingly, the United States and China would likely both work together against the jihadis because both have an interest in stopping fundamentalist Islam. For the United States, it's Turkey and Israel, and for the Chinese, it would be the Uyghurs. With the rise of Putin, the Chinese would want to help Putin to weaken the US's control of Europe. Thus, Chinese weapons and money would flow into Russia. Thus, Putin would be more powerful, and thus he might control more of Eastern Europe. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist. Thank you for watching.